Hey, thanks for coming back. I'm Christopher. Today, we're covering 6 horrifying attacks where circus trainers were mauled by their own animals. From a panicked circus blackout involving a stressed white tiger to a restless backstage chimpanzee that dragged its longtime handler into a violent struggle behind the trailers. But first, let's start with the first story, where a white tiger attacked its trainer. It was October 18th, 2015. A traveling circus had set up outside a small farming town somewhere in the Midwest, operating from a dusty fairground lot surrounded by gravel roads and open fields. Behind the main tent sat rows of trailers, portable fencing, generators, and animal cages packed tightly together after weeks of non-stop travel. Scott Rosley was 41 years old and had spent most of his adult life working around big cats for small independent circus crews. He handled feeding, transport, rehearsals, and cleanup, basically whatever needed to get done. He was experienced, but also extremely comfortable around the animals, to the point where he sometimes ignored smaller safety steps because nothing bad had happened before. The white tiger he worked with most often had been traveling with the show for years, and Scott was considered the main handler whenever the animal needed to be moved. According to one worker, Scott used to say the animal was easier to read than most people he'd worked with. White tigers are Bengal tigers with a rare color mutation, not a separate species. Adult males can weigh more than 450 pounds and can react aggressively when stressed or cornered. Loud noise, flashing lights, unfamiliar movement, and confined spaces can all affect their behavior, especially during transport or crowded events. Earlier that evening, workers had already been dealing with electrical issues around the main tent. One of the lighting rigs kept flickering during rehearsals, and a few crew members later said they smelled overheating wires backstage before the audience even arrived. Then, midway through the performance, part of the overhead lighting suddenly sparked out. Bright flashes lit up the tent before sections of the power cut off completely. Once the alarm started going off, the crowd rushed toward the exits while backstage crews scrambled to secure the animals. Scott was already used to dealing with stressful situations around the cages, so instead of backing away from the chaos, he moved straight toward it. The tiger had already been pacing hard inside the holding cage before the evacuation began. It kept circling in tight loops, smacking its shoulder against the divider bars and flicking its tail around. Big cats in captivity sometimes develop repetitive stress behavior like that after long transport schedules, and this circus had been moving almost non-stop for weeks. One of the divider latches inside the corridor had not fully locked during the confusion. Scott ended up heading into the transfer corridor alone. The corridor connected the holding cage to the transport trailer. It was narrow, less than 4 feet wide in some spots, with metal walls on both sides and sliding divider gates separating the animal sections. At some point during the evacuation, the backup lights behind the trailers also failed, leaving most of the corridor dim except for a few weak emergency bulbs. Scott entered the corridor carrying a flashlight and moved toward the outer trailer gate to secure it before moving the animal. At some point during the struggle, the flashlight hit the metal wall and dropped onto the floor, leaving most of the corridor nearly dark. The tiger shoved against the divider, hard enough to force part of it open. In that tight corridor, Scott barely had space to react before the animal lunged into the passageway and slammed him into the metal wall. People outside the trailers suddenly heard a loud crash, followed by shouting and heavy banging coming from inside the corridor. Evidence at the scene showed Scott tried pulling himself toward the exit while the tiger kept hold of him near the floor. Deep bite injuries around the neck and shoulder caused severe bleeding very quickly. There were also large claw injuries across his upper chest and back from where the animal pinned him down in the narrow passage. Nearby workers tried forcing the divider shut using long metal poles from outside the corridor, but nobody could safely enter while the animal was still moving around inside the passage. By the time they managed to secure the gate, Scott had already lost too much blood. A crew member called for help from the parking area. Responders arrived roughly 20 minutes later after initially driving to the wrong entrance behind the fairgrounds. Investigators later recovered damaged latch hardware, Scott's broken flashlight, and partial trailer camera footage showing the divider shifting seconds before the attack. The final report listed the cause of death as severe blood loss from injuries to the neck and upper body. Several crew members were later interviewed, and partial trailer camera footage from the transfer corridor was reviewed. The death was ultimately ruled an accidental mauling caused by enclosure failure during the evacuation. One failed divider and a few minutes of confusion were enough to turn a cramped transfer corridor into a deadly trap. One traveling lion act would later push an already unstable situation even further during a summer stop beside an empty highway lot. It was July 3rd, 2014. A small traveling circus had stopped beside an old highway rest area somewhere in the south, setting up on a dry gravel lot surrounded by empty service roads and open grass fields. The animal cages sat directly behind the main tent under the afternoon heat, and even by sunset, the temperature was still sitting around 94 degrees. Alan Noren was 38 years old and had worked with lions for most of his adult life. He moved between small touring circuses for years, usually taking handling jobs nobody else wanted. Alan had a habit of forcing routines whenever animals stopped cooperating, especially during rehearsals or feeding. He hated slowing things down for safety checks and got irritated easily when performances fell behind schedule. Alan believed difficult animals needed to be pushed through bad behavior instead of worked around. Over time, frustration started shaping the way he handled problems around the cages. Deep down, Alan saw every difficult animal as something he needed to prove himself against. The more unpredictable they became, the harder he pushed himself to stay in control. Adult male lions can weigh over 500 pounds and are built for short bursts of speed and power rather than long movement. Even in captivity, they remain highly territorial animals and rely heavily on body language, eye contact, and physical positioning during interactions with handlers. A delayed supply truck pushed feeding back for hours, leaving one of the lions restless and pacing around the enclosure through most of the afternoon heat. Even with all that going on, Alan kept preparing for the show like normal. A little before sunset, he entered the holding enclosure, carrying a feeding bucket and a short handling stick used during rehearsals. Another worker stayed outside, nearby stacking equipment cases, but Alan handled the enclosure alone. The holding cage was small and temporary, built with chain fencing and a sliding divider gate connected to the trailer behind it. Years of working around lions had made Alan unusually comfortable inside spaces most people would avoid completely. At first, the animal stayed near the back section watching him. Alan set the bucket near the gate and tried guiding the lion toward the divider before feeding, but the animal ignored the commands and kept pacing along the fence instead. Alan grew frustrated and stepped closer, striking the ground with the handling stick to force the animal back. The pacing only became faster, and the lion's tail started twitching sharply while it circled near the fencing. Then, the animal suddenly stopped moving altogether. For a second, everything inside the enclosure went still. The lion lunged across the cage almost immediately afterward and slammed Alan sideways into the chain fencing hard enough to shake the entire panel. Workers outside heard the metal snap loudly before the shouting started. Alan tried getting back up, but the lion hit him again before he could reach the gate. The animal dragged him down onto the gravel and bit into his torso while pinning him beneath its front weight. Dirt and rocks kicked across the enclosure while Alan tried pulling himself toward the fence using one arm. The worker outside grabbed a metal pole and started striking the fencing while another crew member rushed over carrying a fire extinguisher. They sprayed through the chain links trying to force the lion backward, but the enclosure was too cramped for anyone to safely enter. At one point, the lion released its grip briefly, and Alan tried crawling toward the side gate. Before he could reach it, the animal lunged again and dragged him back across the gravel. By the time workers finally managed to separate the lion behind the rear divider, Alan had already lost a dangerous amount of blood. Large injuries across his stomach and chest were bleeding heavily onto the gravel floor near the fencing. Responders had trouble finding the correct access road behind the circus lot and arrived roughly 20 minutes later. Alan was still lying beside the fence when help finally reached the cage area. He died at the scene shortly afterward from severe blood loss and internal injuries caused by the attack. In the aftermath, feeding buckets and bent sections of chain fencing still remained scattered across the gravel where the struggle had started earlier that evening. Investigators later questioned several circus workers about the delayed feeding schedule, extreme heat, and handling decisions leading up to the attack. The death was ultimately ruled an accidental animal handling incident, and the Lion Act was temporarily suspended afterward. For handlers living on the road full-time, routine can start replacing caution without them even noticing it. The The next incident begins during an overnight unload, where heavy rain and a jammed divider left a leopard handler working inside near total darkness. It was March 11, 2015. A traveling circus had pulled into an industrial warehouse lot somewhere in the Midwest after heavy rain slowed traffic along the highway overnight. Equipment trailers and animal transports were lined up beside the empty loading buildings, while workers unloaded cages under portable floodlights, reflecting off the wet pavement. Jonas Ford was 33 years old and still fairly new to handling large cats. Most of his earlier work involved loading gear, driving transport truck, and helping crews during overnight stops before he started taking on more animal-related work. Jonas wanted badly to prove he could handle bigger responsibilities around the cages instead of being treated like extra labor. He hated looking uncertain around the older handlers and usually volunteered for jobs nobody else wanted during late-night unloads. Jonas cared so much about proving himself that slowing down sometimes felt worse to him than taking a risk. Leopards are solitary predators that rely heavily on speed and close-range reactions. Adult females can weigh over 130 pounds and are capable of sudden directional changes inside extremely tight spaces. Unlike larger cats, leopards are especially comfortable climbing and moving through confined environments. The storm that night had already complicated almost everything behind the trailers. Rainwater kept running down the metal ramps connecting the transport cages, while workers tried unloading equipment as quickly as possible before the weather got worse. Several extension lights near the rear trailers flickered on and off from moisture around the generators, leaving parts of the unloading area unevenly lit. One of the sliding divider gates inside the leopard transport cage became stuck halfway along the track during unloading. Most of the crew stayed busy securing equipment and covering supplies from the rain, so Jonas grabbed a flashlight and volunteered to free the divider himself before the next unloading stage started. The transport enclosure was narrow enough that Jonas had to angle his shoulders slightly while moving inside. Wet metal flooring covered most of the bottom section, and rainwater dripped through gaps along the trailer roof, while thunder rolled somewhere behind the warehouse buildings. At first, the leopard stayed crouched near the opposite end of the divider, while Jonas worked the latch mechanism with a metal tool. The flashlight beam bounced across the cage walls every time he shifted position. Then, one of the floodlights outside suddenly shut off. The inside of the enclosure became noticeably darker almost immediately. Jonas adjusted the flashlight toward the divider track and tried stepping around a puddle near the gate rail, but his boot slipped across the wet flooring and sent him sideways into the metal divider. The sound alone triggered the reaction. The leopard burst through the partially open divider gap before Jonas could fully stand back up. In a space that small, there was almost nowhere for him to create distance once the animal reached him. People outside the trailer heard banging against the transport walls, followed by Jonas yelling for help from inside the enclosure. Workers rushed toward the cage, but the narrow entrance made it almost impossible to safely reach him, while the leopard continued moving around inside. Jonas tried shielding his neck while backing himself into the corner of the enclosure, but the leopard kept lunging in the cramped space every time he moved. Workers outside could barely see through the rain and flashing light while they struggled to force the divider back across the opening using metal bars. After several attempts, the divider finally slammed enough into place for the crew to reach Jonas through the entrance gate. By then, blood had already spread across most of the wet flooring beneath him. A nearby warehouse worker used an office landline to call for help, while the circus crew worked to keep Jonas awake near the loading ramp outside the cage. Emergency responders eventually reached the lot through the flooded service road behind the warehouses. Jonas was transported out of the property alive, but he died not long afterward from severe blood loss caused by injuries to the neck and upper chest. The final findings listed the wet flooring and partially jammed divider gate as contributing factors in the incident. Investigators later ruled the death an accidental animal handling incident linked to the jammed divider gate and hazardous unloading conditions during the storm. A lot of younger circus workers learned dangerous jobs by stepping into situations they probably weren't fully ready for yet. The next case centers around a veteran circus performer trying to continue an aging bear act that had already become harder to control. It was November 22nd, 2017. A traveling circus had stopped outside a small fairground somewhere in the upper Midwest near the end of its touring season. Patches of old snow still sat along the trailer lanes, and most of the animal enclosures remained closed through the afternoon to keep heat inside. Walter Brees was 57 years old and had spent most of his life performing with bears in smaller circus acts. Unlike the younger crews constantly moving between jobs, Walter had stayed with the same act for years and built most of his daily life around the rehearsal routines. He still treated the performances the same way he had decades earlier, even as both he and the animals got older. Walter struggled to accept how much the bear had slowed down physically over time. Continuing the act had become deeply personal to him, almost like stopping would mean admitting that part of his life was over too. By that point, the bear involved in the act was already getting old for an animal that size. Adult brown bears can weigh more than 700 pounds, and older captive bears often start developing joint pain, balance problems, and slower movement after years of transport and performance routines. The problems started during rehearsal setup that evening. Workers moving equipment around the practice tent noticed the bear hesitating near the trailer ramp while being guided toward the ring area. The animal moved slower than usual across the frozen gravel and shifted awkwardly while stepping over the entrance track leading into the tent. At one point, it paused near the edge of the ramp long enough that one of the crew members had to help steady the lead chain before the bear continued moving again. Walter noticed the hesitation too, but he still wanted to finish the rehearsal before the next day's performances started. Inside the tent, portable heaters rattled beside the seating rows while workers adjusted lighting rigs above the practice ring. The rehearsal itself was simple and mostly involved movement cues and positioning around a raised wooden platform near the center of the sawdust floor. Walter guided the bear into the ring using a lead pole attached near the harness collar while workers finished adjusting equipment around the tent. The animal already seemed uncomfortable inside the rehearsal space, repeatedly shifting its weight near the edge of the sawdust ring instead of staying still between cues. Trouble started when Walter tried guiding the bear onto the raised platform. The bear's back leg slipped against the wooden edge and its full weight shifted sideways. Walter tightened the lead pole trying to correct it, but the bear lurched further off balance and dropped onto all four, twisting toward him. Not with aggression, just 600 pounds of disoriented animal with no stable footing beneath it. The lead pole caught Walter across the forearm on the way loose. He stumbled backward against the platform edge and went down into the sawdust just as the bear came down on top of him. What followed wasn't a mauling in the way people imagine one. There was no roaring, no frenzy. The bear was disoriented and in pain, and Walter was directly beneath it. The bear came down across his torso and drove the air from his lungs. He tried to roll, but was already pinned against the platform support. The bear's weight redistributed awkwardly as it struggled to right itself, pressing down across his ribcage with increasing force. Several ribs gave way in the first few seconds. Walter managed one short cry before the compression became too severe for his lungs to move air. The bear swiped downward twice while trying to push itself upright. The first swipe caught Walter across the left shoulder and upper chest, tearing through his jacket and the skin beneath. The second connected with the left side of his head. His skull struck the wooden support beam behind him. Workers started banging metal equipment against the barriers and dragging noisy carts toward the ring. Sawdust lifted into the air. Another handler eventually redirected the bear back toward the holding corridor, using food containers and compressed air near the entrance gate. When they reached Walter, he was unresponsive. Blood had soaked through the sawdust around the platform support. Emergency crews arrived shortly after, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was crushing injuries to the chest and severe blunt trauma to the head. What happened to Walter felt less like sudden chaos and more like a situation that had been slowly falling apart for years. The next attack would be much faster and quieter, involving a jaguar reacting almost instantly inside a narrow enclosure. It was August 9, 2018. A traveling circus had stopped outside a small county fairground somewhere in the southwest during the middle of a summer tour. By early morning, most of the public areas were still empty, while workers behind the tents cleaned cages and prepared equipment before the afternoon performances. The heat was already climbing past 85 degrees not long after sunrise. Dustin Sorrell was 29 years old and one of the younger animal handlers on the crew. He had only worked directly around big cats for a few years, but he quickly became known for volunteering for the most hands-on enclosure work whenever he had the chance. Dustin genuinely enjoyed being close to the animals and acted more relaxed around the cages than some of the older handlers liked. The fast pace and unpredictability of the work were part of what kept him interested. Around the animals, Dustin carried himself more like someone chasing excitement than someone doing dangerous work. If Scott trusted routine and Alan tried controlling every situation situation, Dustin was almost the opposite. He seemed to enjoy the unpredictability around the cages more than anything else about circus life. And compared to the earlier animals in these stories, jaguars behave very differently at close range. They rely heavily on speed, reflexes, and precise bursts of movement rather than intimidation displays or prolonged aggression. Adult jaguars are compact but heavily muscled animals with one of the strongest bite forces among big cats, especially for their size. Inside tight enclosures, they can change direction and react almost instantly with very little space to move. That morning started as a routine cleanup behind the animal trailers. The jaguar had already been shifted into a narrow side compartment while Dustin cleaned the larger holding section nearby. The enclosure used a sliding divider system designed to separate the animal safely during feeding and maintenance work. Around him, the morning cleanup behind the cages was already fully underway, with hoses running, generators humming, and workers moving supplies between trailers. Nothing about the enclosure area felt especially tense or unusual that morning. Water spread slowly across the concrete floor while Dustin rinsed debris toward the drainage corner near the divider gate. He moved casually through the enclosure, spraying down the walls and occasionally kicking standing water toward the drain, while the jaguar stayed low behind the divider bars, watching him move around the cage. At one point, Dustin crouched near the divider track to pull debris away from the drainage corner beside the gate. As he shifted the bucket across the floor, the plastic container suddenly scraped loudly against the metal divider and tipped sideways near the partially latched opening. The jaguar moved immediately. People working nearby barely had time to react before the animal lunged through the gap near the divider gate. The entire attack unfolded within only a few seconds. The jaguar clamped onto Dustin near the upper shoulder and neck area while he tried pushing himself backward across the wet concrete. The struggle stayed concentrated near the divider opening until nearby handlers forced the sliding barrier shut again using the external control handle. By the time the divider locked back into place, Dustin was lying motionless beside the drainage corner. Workers pulled him out of the enclosure and moved him beside the trailer lane, while emergency help was requested from the fairground office nearby. The entire incident happened so quickly that some workers nearby did not fully understand what happened until Dustin had already been pulled out of the enclosure. Dustin died at the scene from severe blood loss caused by injuries to the neck and upper chest. Later that morning, the overturned bucket still remained near the divider track where Dustin had slipped earlier during the cleanup. The final findings listed the partially secured divider gate and wet flooring conditions as contributing factors. Investigators later reviewed the enclosure setup and confirmed the divider gate had not been fully secured before cleanup began. The death was ruled an accidental handling incident. I think what makes Dustin's case stand out is how casual everything felt right before the attack. The crew was already busy with normal morning work, and Dustin himself probably thought he was just finishing another routine cleanup job. The final story shifts away from big cats completely and into a backstage chimpanzee enclosure where years of close human contact had started creating a very different kind of danger. It was February 3rd, 2013. A small traveling circus had stopped outside a community fairground somewhere in the southeast during several days of cold rain and muddy weather. Most of the audience tents were already closed for the night, but backstage crews still moved between the trailers, organizing props, costumes, and animal equipment for the next afternoon's performances. Brian Keswick was 46 years old and had spent most of his adult life working with performing chimpanzees. Unlike the handlers in the earlier stories, Brian worked in much closer physical contact with the animals almost every day. Feeding, grooming, rehearsals, and costume preparation usually happened only a few feet away from the chimp he handled most often. Brian believed routines stayed smoother when the animals saw him as familiar instead of threatening. He treated the chimp more like a difficult co-worker than something truly dangerous. If Dustin chased excitement around the cages, Brian was almost the opposite. He relied heavily on familiarity and routine after spending years around the same animal. Working around chimpanzees came with a completely different kind of risk from the big cats earlier in these stories. Adult male chimps are extremely strong for their size and tend to lash out through grabbing, biting, pulling, and repeated physical force once they become overwhelmed or agitated during close contact situations. The problems that night started during costume preparation behind the trailers. The backstage area had become crowded with folding rack, prop bins, costume containers, and audio equipment stacked beneath the trailer awnings to keep everything out of the rain. Workers kept moving through the narrow walkways, carrying supplies, while crews prepared the animal acts for the next day. day. Brian brought the chimp into a preparation area beside one of the costume trailers while he adjusted part of the harness used during performances. The chimp already seemed uncomfortable with the fitting and repeatedly pulled at the straps around its shoulders while Brian tried repositioning them. At one point, the chimp suddenly jerked backward hard enough to yank part of the harness loose from Brian's hands. The movement knocked over a folding rack beside them, sending metal poles and costume pieces crashing across the wet pavement. Everything became chaotic after that. The chimp grabbed onto Brian's sleeves and pulled him sideways into the stacked equipment before nearby workers fully realized the situation had turned violent. Brian tried getting back to his feet while the chimp kept grabbing at his arms, shoulders, and head. Unlike the earlier attacks, this one never stayed still for more than a few seconds. Brian and the chimp kept crashing into bins, folding chairs, and costume racks scattered around the preparation area, while workers crowded near the entrance, yelling over each other, trying to figure out how to safely intervene. Several people hesitated once they got close because the attack had become so frantic. Every time Brian tried pulling himself away, the chimp immediately grabbed onto him again while moving around the equipment-strewn pavement outside the trailer. At one point, Brian nearly reached the opening near the trailer lane before the chimp dragged him backward by his jacket and knocked both of them into a stack of plastic prop containers. Eventually, several crew members managed to force the chimp back long enough for others to pull Brian away from the preparation area and onto the gravel beside the trailers. By then, he was barely conscious. Workers used towels and spare costume fabric to try slowing the bleeding around his arms, face, neck, and upper chest, while someone from the crew called for emergency help from the fairground office nearby. Brian died later that night after suffering severe blood loss and major injuries to the face, neck, arms, and upper body during the attack. The case was later ruled an accidental animal handling death caused by close physical contact during backstage costume preparation. For me, Brian's story feels unsettling in a different way because so much of it came from familiarity instead of fear. After hearing stories like this, it's hard not to wonder how much of circus life depended on people convincing themselves everything was still under control.